It was 4 seconds, but it played like a full minute when you were watching it happen in real time, because silence in Washington is never just silence. Hillary Rodham Clinton, former First Lady, former U.S. Senator, former Secretary of State, former presidential nominee, sat there with the practiced posture of someone who's outlasted more investigations than most lawmakers have ever launched. She started to answer, stopped, started again, and for a beat, the room realized the question wasn't complicated enough to hide behind procedure. It wasn't a clever gotcha. It wasn't a trapdoor made of jargon. It was the kind of plain English question that makes every polished instinct look suspicious. Have you ever said, out loud, "I was wrong," and then told the whole truth? No deflection, no soft landing, no famous person escape hatch. 3 feet away, Vice President J.D. Vance watched the way men watch when they've learned that waiting is sometimes the sharpest blade you can hold without swinging it. He didn't fidget. He didn't rescue her with a follow-up. He didn't rush to fill the air the way politicians usually do when the camera starts smelling discomfort. The hearing room was packed. Staffers, lawyers, press, spectators, everyone standing still like the whole place had been paused by a remote. You could hear the ventilation system doing its dull mechanical job. You could hear the clock tick. And you could feel every set of eyes recalculating what it meant that she couldn't just answer. Then Clinton finally gave the line she always gives when she wants the past to act like a shield. "I believe my record speaks for itself." Vance didn't argue with it, which is why it hit harder than any speech could. He just said, calmly and almost politely, "Yes, Secretary Clinton, it does." And that was the end of the moment and the beginning of the replay. People always think the big part of a hearing is the accusations, the fireworks, the senators auditioning for cable news. But the big part is often the one clean sentence that lands because it doesn't sound like it's trying to land. That exchange didn't feel like politics so much as gravity doing what gravity does, and you could tell Clinton felt it too. If you want to understand why it worked, you have to rewind to the first 3 hours, because the closing punch only lands when the setup is built with patience. This wasn't the standard committee choreography where the chair slips in from the side door like a stagehand, and the witness pretends it's all normal. J.D. Vance came through the main doors, walked the length of the room, and let every camera capture the unhurried approach. He carried one leather folder, no stack of binders, no dramatic props. The visual message being, "I don't need more paper. I just need the right paper." And he didn't smile, which in Washington is its own kind of signal, because smiling is often how people soften what they're about to avoid. Clinton was already seated, early, as if the clock itself was another opponent she preferred to beat to the punch. That's a Clinton habit, the kind you develop after decades in public life. Arrive first, look settled, make the room feel like it belongs to you. She wore the uniform of seriousness, dark suit, precise hair, composed face. Nothing flashy, nothing accidental, nothing that could become a distracting headline. She watched him with that controlled half-smile she's used on 1,000 adversaries, the expression that says, "I've survived bigger storms than you." Biographically, she wasn't wrong. She'd been testifying in Washington while he was still a kid in Middletown, Ohio, living a life nobody in Georgetown writes speeches about. Vance's story matters here because it explains why his style is different, even if you don't like his politics. He's not a man who learned patience from meditation apps and donor dinners. He learned it the hard way, the kind that teaches you to wait, because waiting is survival. He came out of instability, found structure in the Marines, found language in college, found strategy in law school, and then found power in politics. That arc gives him a particular calm in rooms where other politicians perform outrage like it's oxygen. Clinton has spent her career mastering those rooms too, which is why the matchup was always going to be less about volume and more about control. From Clinton's side, this was supposed to be another hearing. Tense, noisy, survivable, filed away in the long archive of "Here we go again." Her allies have spent years framing investigations into her orbit as partisan theater, and that frame has protected her more times than critics want to admit. But in this dramatized telling, the hearing's origin story is what made the familiar defense feel shakier. The pressure wasn't coming from just one corner. Instead of a clean partisan split, the story insisted on something messier: procedural battles, subpoenas, depositions, and the kind of public impatience that doesn't care about party loyalty. That matters because when the audience believes the room is divided purely by ideology, it's easier to dismiss every question as performance. Vance opened with politeness that sounded almost sincere, and that's the first place Clinton's instincts likely told her she had this handled. He recited her resume the way a lawyer recites facts into the record. First Lady, Senator, Secretary of State, Presidential nominee, 65 million votes. He acknowledged the scale of her career, and she gave the small nod you give when someone is saying what you believe to be true about you. Then he pivoted and tightened the air by pairing that resume with an unflattering contrast. The long resistance to showing up, the procedural trench warfare, the sense that testimony had to be forced. You can hear in that pivot what he was really doing, turning "I've been investigated forever" from a badge into a question mark. He promised, explicitly, that he wasn't there to grandstand, and the way he said it made the promise feel less like virtue signaling and more like a warning. No speeches, no sweeping claims, just specific questions tied to dates, names, and publicly known documents, or at least what this narrative treats as public. If answers lined up with the paper, the hearing would be short. If they didn't, it would stretch, because the paper doesn't get tired. That's the kind of approach Clinton has beaten before, but usually when the questioner can't resist turning it into a sermon. Vance's edge in this scene is that he refuses the sermon and makes the witness either answer or be seen not answering. Then comes the first curveball, the kind that makes the witness's legal team sit up straighter. He starts somewhere else first. He says, "Let's begin with emails. Not the scandal everyone came for, but an older scar that still has cultural muscle." Clinton's defense posture is familiar here. Lawyers reviewed, categories were drawn, personal versus official. Lines were followed. Decisions were made. Vance keeps the focus on sequence and control. Who decided, when they decided, and what it means when decisions happen after a subpoena is in the air. He doesn't have to say crime to make the viewer feel the shadow of the word, because the viewer has heard that music before. Notice the rhetorical trick. He treats "I can't recall" and "my legal team handled it" not as shields but as admissions that nobody outside the circle got to verify the choices. He leans on tools and terminology in a way that sounds like law school without sounding like a lecture, which is exactly how you make the audience feel you're being fair. Clinton can point to prior investigations and prior conclusions, and in real life, that's often enough to move on. But in this dramatic structure, Vance's move is to suggest the public's confidence was built on processes that might not have been as complete as advertised, without asserting it as settled fact. He doesn't declare the ending. He asks whether the ending everyone remembers is as final as everyone pretends. From there, he widens the lens to pattern, which is always dangerous because pattern arguments can turn into storytelling instead of proof. He brings up opposition research and the swirl of contractors, law firms, and documents that everyone references like it's common knowledge but rarely explains clearly. The point isn't to convict her on the spot. The point is to plant the idea that the same political machine can both delete what hurts and distribute what helps. Clinton tries to answer the way politicians answer when the underlying mechanics are messy. Through process, language, and distance. Counsel did this, staff did that, others handled details. Vance's counter is to keep dragging it back to the basic yes or no question people can understand, because yes or no is where careful reputations go to sweat. Then he shifts again into the territory of money, access, and influence, the eternal Washington suspicion that follows every powerful family like a second shadow. He doesn't have to accuse her of taking a bribe. He just has to describe a set of coincidences and ask the audience what word they'd use. Coincidence is the safest weapon in political storytelling because it lets you imply without alleging, and viewers do the rest in their own heads. Clinton responds with philanthropy language, effectiveness language, mission language, the kind that works on donors and sympathetic journalists because it sounds noble. Vance calls it what it looks like in a hearing, a press release, which is his way of saying the witness is campaigning instead of answering. And then, inevitably, the hearing's center of gravity arrives, because the room came for one topic, and everyone pretends they didn't. Jeffrey Epstein's name changes the temperature, not because anyone needs a lecture on why, but because the association itself carries a cultural toxicity that sticks to whoever touches it. This is where a careful writer has to stay careful, because the public record around Epstein is vast, messy, and frequently exploited by people who like scandal more than truth. So in this telling, Vance sticks to what he frames as logs, schedules, correspondence, things that sound concrete even when the audience hasn't personally checked them. He reads dates, asks whether Clinton knew, and watches her reach for the one answer that keeps the door closed. I don't recall. The first "I don't recall" doesn't sound damning because time erases details and people forget. The fifth "I don't recall" starts sounding less like memory and more like strategy, because repetition turns a defense into a pattern all its own. Vance points that out without calling her a liar, which is a smart move because liar invites a fight while selective invites a doubt. He contrasts her ability to recall other high-profile events with her sudden fog when the topic becomes personally dangerous, and he lets the audience decide what that means. That's how you build tension without making claims you can't prove. You narrate the contrast and let the discomfort do the talking. He then returns to the months of resistance, and he frames it as a moral question instead of a legal one, which is how you make a procedural dispute feel like a character test. Why fight so hard to avoid showing up, he asks, when the subject isn't some abstract policy, but the harm done to real people? Clinton answers the way experienced witnesses answer: scope, format, process, counsel, concerns, the familiar vocabulary of Washington's self-protection. Vance counters by ranking concerns, lawyers versus survivors, without needing to attack her personally, because the ranking alone makes the witness look out of step. The room in the narrative starts to feel less like a partisan arena and more like a jury watching someone decide what matters. Then comes the most volatile section, where politics, personal history, and public allegations collide, and the writer has to handle it like nitroglycerin. Vance brings up past accusations against Bill Clinton that have circulated for decades, and he frames the issue as credibility rather than guilt. He doesn't say, "This happened." He says, "These claims exist. These names are public. These stories have been argued about for years, and your posture toward them matters." Clinton's instinct is to reject the framing, to push the topic away as unfair, irrelevant, recycled, or malicious, because that's what any veteran witness does when the ground feels unstable. Vance's move is to connect her public language about believing women with her private incentives to defend her family. And he lets the contradiction sit there like an uncovered wire. At this point, Clinton deploys what has saved her again and again, the resilience speech. 40 years of service, countless investigations, every headline survived, every opponent outlasted, still standing, still here, still answering. It's a powerful speech because it's partly true. Survival does count for something, and most people would have snapped under half the pressure she's endured. The problem is that survival isn't the same as transparency, and this is where Vance's style matters, because he refuses to treat endurance as an answer. He waits until she finishes, then asks a single question so plain it can't be answered with institutional grandeur. Have you ever said, "I was wrong," and then told the whole truth? Once, clearly, without protective language. Not "mistakes were made," not "I take responsibility," not "we were dealing with evolving information," not "people disagree," not "that's been litigated." Just the simple human confession of error followed by the full account, the way ordinary people are expected to behave when they're caught. Clinton goes quiet because the question is designed to make every polished answer sound like avoidance. And in that 4-second gap, the hearing becomes less about documents and more about the image of a public figure searching her own history for a moment of unguarded accountability. When she finally says her record speaks for itself, it lands as both a claim and an escape hatch. And that duality is why it replays so well. Vance's "Yes, Secretary Clinton, it does" lands as the kind of closing line you don't have to shout, because it arrives like a door shutting on its own. He ends the session without a sermon, which denies her the usual opponent she knows how to beat, the angry prosecutor on television. He walks out the way he walked in, slow, controlled, no need for the hallway gaggle, because the scene is designed to suggest he believes the tape will do his arguing for him. Clinton, in this telling, sits for a moment after the gavel, absorbing the new reality that she may have met someone who won't be disarmed by her composure. Afterward, the public splits the way it always does, because America doesn't watch hearings for information so much as for permission to feel what it already feels. Her supporters replay the resilience speech as proof she can't be shaken, and her critics replay the 4-second silence as proof she can't be trusted. The networks run both clips on a loop, not to clarify anything, but because the loop itself becomes the product. Even the neutral takes, the ones that pretend to live above the fight, end up choosing a side by choosing which clip to lead with. And that's how a hearing becomes a Rorschach test. You don't see what happened, you see what you came to see. In the cooler analysis, the kind people do off-camera, in offices where power actually moves, the interesting part isn't whether Clinton won or lost the day. The interesting part is how Vance used restraint as a weapon, because restraint is rare enough in Washington that it looks like authority. He didn't accuse her of crimes, he didn't pronounce verdicts, he didn't claim secret knowledge. He just built a ladder of questions and watched whether she climbed it. She responded with the classic repertoire: process language, distance, moral framing, institutional pride. Tools that have protected her for decades. But in this narrative, those tools look less like answers and more like techniques. And once the audience sees technique, it starts doubting everything technique touches. That's why the silence matters more than the allegations floating around it, because silence is harder to fact-check and easier to feel. The audience can argue forever about who said what, what's proven, what's alleged, what's misrepresented, what's weaponized, what's unfair. But 4 seconds of a powerful person not answering a simple question is something viewers can interpret without reading a single document. It becomes a symbol, And symbols are the real currency of politics, because symbols travel faster than nuance ever will. Whether that symbol is fair is almost beside the point, because fairness rarely determines what sticks. If you're trying to tell this story responsibly, you don't have to declare anyone guilty of anything, and you shouldn't. You can say, as a matter of observation, that Clinton's brand has always been endurance, and endurance can look like invincibility until someone reframes it as evasion. You can say, as a matter of perception, that Vance's brand in this scene is controlled specificity, and controlled specificity looks persuasive even when viewers don't verify the underlying claims. You can ask, without accusing, whether American politics has confused not convicted with fully answered, because the public has never been great at separating legal outcomes from moral clarity. And you can admit, plainly, that you're watching a dramatized version of the kind of hearing the country is primed to believe in, because the country is addicted to the idea of a reckoning. The most revealing detail, to me, isn't even the final exchange, sharp as it is. It's that Clinton goes back to the one line that has kept her afloat. Let the record talk, so she doesn't have to. That line works when the audience respects the institutions that produce the record, when people trust that investigations are thorough and conclusions are final. It works a lot less well in an era when half the country believes every institution is either incompetent or captured, and the other half believes the same thing about different institutions. So the record speaking sounds, to many ears now, like a powerful person outsourcing accountability to paperwork. And Vance's little reply, yes, it does, works because it doesn't tell the audience what to think. It invites them to think they already thought it. It implies, without asserting, that the record is louder than her speech, and that's a dangerous implication for any political figure built on speeches. If Clinton's superpower is surviving the storm, Vance's strategy here is to change what survival means, to suggest that surviving isn't the same as settling. That's not a legal argument, it's a cultural argument, and cultural arguments are what elections are made of. The question is whether this kind of scene changes minds, or just hardens them, because America is full of people who don't change their minds anymore, they just collect new reasons. The way I see it, the real aftershock didn't happen in the hearing room at all, because hearing rooms are built to absorb shock, the way old buildings absorb wind. The aftershock happened in the spaces between people who actually matter in politics, the quiet spaces where nobody is posturing for cameras. It happened in donor calls where someone says, "I'm not making a statement, I'm just saying it didn't look great." And everyone understands what that means. It happened in staff meetings where the comms director asks whether the clip is climbing or falling, and the policy director asks whether any of it is verifiably wrong. It happened in the private moment when a veteran operative watches the 4 seconds again and realizes the problem isn't the question, it's how clean the question is. Because you can fact-check a date, you can argue over a document, you can litigate a quote, you can even drown a narrative in context. But you cannot unsee a pause when the pause feels like the truth. That's the paradox of modern American politics. The least technical moment is often the one that ends up feeling most real. It's why viral clips don't need to be complete to be effective. They just need to be emotionally legible. And the silence was legible in a way that 10,000 words of explanation will never be. Clinton's people understand this, which is why they moved immediately, because the Clinton machine doesn't sleep, it repositions. The first move is always to define the event before someone else defines it, to put a label on the box so the viewer thinks the contents are already known. Political theater, relitigating settled matters, partisan exercise, same old playbook. Pick your phrase, the point is the same. If you can make the public feel like they've seen this movie before, you can reduce the shock of the moment you just lost. In that sense, the record speaks for itself, is not merely a line, it's a doctrine. And doctrine is how you protect brand. But doctrine has a weakness. It works best when the audience still believes the institutions that produced the record. It works when people accept that cleared means the story is over, that no charges means no problem, that procedure equals truth. In 1998, that logic still had oxygen. In 2016, it was already wheezing. In 2026, in this fictionalized world you're building, it's on life support. The country has been trained, by years of mutual suspicion, to treat every conclusion as provisional and every clearance as political. So when Clinton points to the record, a lot of people don't hear finality, they hear distance. That's where Vance's approach lands like a well-thrown stone, because he isn't asking the institutions to vouch for him. He's asking the witness to vouch for herself. And that's a different kind of demand. It's personal without being personal, which is the most dangerous kind of personal in politics. You can fight an accusation. You can't easily fight a request for sincerity without looking like you don't have it. And if you've spent decades training yourself never to offer free sincerity on camera, the demand becomes a trap all by itself. Now, if you're being honest, you also have to admit that the Vance method has its own sleight of hand. Just asking questions can be a way to smuggle conclusions into the listener's mind without carrying the burden of proving them. There's a reason politicians love timelines. A timeline feels like evidence even when it's curated, and it feels neutral even when it's not. When he strings events together and calls it a pattern, he's doing what prosecutors do, but without having to meet the prosecutor's standard. So the viewer is left with the real question that nobody says out loud. Is the pattern persuasive because it's true or because it's arranged? That question is especially important because Clinton isn't just a person in this story. She's a symbol people have been arguing about for most of their lives. For some Americans, Hillary Rodham Clinton is synonymous with competence and endurance, the ultimate survivor of a political culture that devours women for sport. For others, she represents a kind of elite self-protection so polished it almost counts as a separate branch of government. Both views can coexist because symbols don't require consistency. They require emotional utility. So when Vance asks about accountability, he isn't simply questioning her, he's pressuring the symbol. And symbols react differently than humans do. And that's why the immediate split reactions were so predictable. You could script them before the gavel hit. On one side, people praised her for not taking the bait, for maintaining composure, for refusing to legitimize what they see as a smear machine. On the other side, people praised Vance for finally doing what nobody has done, for staying calm, for forcing the evasions into view. The middle, such as it exists anymore, didn't decide who was right. It decided who looked more in control. And in televised politics, control is treated like truth, even when it's just stagecraft with better posture. If you're aiming to keep this story sharp without turning it into a blunt instrument, the smartest move is to let the audience feel the tension without telling them what verdict to render. Ask the questions that the hearing implies without stating answers you can't substantiate. Why does Washington reward people who can survive questions more than people who can answer them? Why do we accept "my team handled it" as a normal response when ordinary citizens are expected to know what they signed, sent, deleted, or missed? And why does accountability always seem to arrive as performance rather than as a basic civic habit? Because that's what this scene is really about, at least in my opinion, the gulf between public language and private responsibility. Clinton's style is institutional, meaning she speaks like a person who believes institutions are the ultimate referee. Vance's style is populist legal, meaning he speaks like a person who believes institutions are compromised and only direct answers carry weight. Those are two incompatible faiths, and a hearing becomes a church fight when the believers don't share the same God. So the question of who won becomes a question of which faith the audience already holds. In the days after, the story doesn't move by press releases alone, it moves by incentives. If donors start waiting, campaigns start adjusting, because campaigns are just expensive mirrors of donor confidence. If friendly think tanks quietly pause invitations, the pause becomes a kind of verdict without anyone stating one. If party leadership stays silent, silence is read as calculation, and calculation is read as abandonment. That's the real language of power. Not what people say, but what they stop doing. And you can see how Clinton's allies would try to rebuild the frame quickly, because the hearing, again in this narrative, creates a new kind of vulnerability. The old vulnerability was scandal fatigue. She could always say, "Here they go again," and her base would nod. The new vulnerability is the sense that someone found a question she can't drown in experience. Experience, in her telling, is proof of durability. Experience, in his telling, is proof that she has mastered evasion. That's a nasty reframing because it turns the strength into a suspicion. And once a strength becomes a suspicion, every future appearance risks reinforcing the suspicion. That's why you'd expect Clinton's next moves to be almost aggressively normal. A speech on democracy, a speech on institutions, a speech on women's rights, a speech on global leadership, something big and abstract and morally elevated. Those speeches do two things at once. They remind supporters why they love her, and they pull the conversation away from the specific questions she didn't answer. Specificity is where the hearing hurt. Abstraction is where she has always been safe. The danger is that Vance's whole strategy is to make abstraction look like flight. And flight is a terrible look when the question is, tell the truth. Meanwhile, Vance, if he's smart, doesn't spike the football. He doesn't need to, because spiking the football changes the tone from serious oversight to partisan victory lap, and that helps Clinton. He keeps acting like it was just another Tuesday, like he's the guy doing his job while everyone else turns it into drama. That posture is fake in its own way. Every politician knows the camera is oxygen. But the performance of non-performance is incredibly effective. It implies you're too busy with real work to care about the clip, which is precisely what makes the clip stronger. And then you get the secondary conversation, the one that always follows a viral moment, where people pretend to analyze technique as if technique is separate from truth. Was the question fair, people ask, as if fairness is ever the standard in political combat. Was it relevant, they ask, as if relevance is not often a synonym for vulnerability. Was it respectful, they ask, as if respect is something our politics has budgeted for in the last decade. The honest answer is that it was effective, and effectiveness is the only metric that survives in the public mind.